Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. We're glad you're here. And now our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
There are presently 5 generations actively in the workforce that all bring different mindsets and expectations about the workplace. This is a fact. What's still up for discussion, though, is what we can do to get these different generational cohorts to work better together to achieve results and prevent the frustrations that impede performance and dampen morale. In my view, every leader has a clear mandate to do 2 things: to accomplish the mission and to bring out the best in the people around them. So this conversation about generational differences is an important one that we need to have. That's why I'm so excited to have this conversation with an expert who has studied and written about this topic for over 20 years. We'll focus on how to retain and engage young millennials and Gen Z folks specifically, but I'm confident that we'll have something for everyone. Through my guests' informed and upbeat perspective, we're going to give people hope for the future and some ways to address some of the frustrations that may have been getting them down. So no matter what generation you're in, we've got something for you today on the Mission First, People Always podcast.
Welcome to the Mission First, People Always podcast, where we talk about better business results, stronger teams, more successful careers, and happier lives. Along the way, we hope to bust some biases, build some bridges, and have some fun. We're glad you're here. And now, our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
It's Dr. Mike Patterson, your host of the Mission First, People Always podcast, where we talk about what it takes to be a great leader and how to build great teams. And sometimes we'll talk about new ideas in the world of business and commerce and how leadership applies in these new contexts. I'm the author of the book, Mission First, People Always, the definitive guide to balancing people and performance, and it's available on Amazon or wherever you buy your books online. I'm also a trainer, consultant, and coach focused on leader and team development. Let me remind you, as I always do, subscribe or follow, leave a review, and tell a friend about our podcast. I do the show because I sincerely want to help people lead better and get more done with and through others. I believe everyone I invite to be a guest on the show can add value to your leadership journey. And I like to showcase talented people who care deeply about healthy organizations and good leadership, just as I do. And today is no exception. My guest today is Haydn Shaw. Haydn has researched and helped clients regarding generational differences for over 20 years. He's the author of the book, Sticking Points: How to Get 4 Generations Working Together in the 12 Places They Come Apart, and FranklinCovey's bestselling workshops, Leading Across Generations and Working Across Generations. He has spoken to over 100,000 people and worked with more than 1,500 businesses, from Fortune 500 companies to startups, not-for-profit organizations, and governmental agencies. Haydn speaks and consults on generations, leadership, management, trust, productivity, and change management. The results from his long-term organizational development and change projects have been written up in case studies. Haydn has been hailed as a leadership guru by the Washington Post, and he speaks and consults about 160 days a year with clients who consistently invite him back. For 21 years, he was a senior consultant with FranklinCovey and is one of a handful of consultants in FranklinCovey to win the coveted Chairman's Award. Haydn lives in a multi-generational household in a suburb of Chicago. He and his wife, Lori, and her disabled brother are boomer Gen X cuspers. Their 4 teenagers are millennials. His mother-in-law is a traditionalist, and I'm excited to learn from this expert. Haydn Shaw, welcome to the Mission First, People Always podcast. I'm glad you're here.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I've especially looked forward to having you on the show, Haydn, because you and I go back I guess we met 15, 17 years ago. I was the director of leadership development for a fairly large pharmaceutical company. You were one of the guys we would bring in on a regular basis to train our leaders. You always did a great job. We connected and found that we have a lot in common on a lot of different levels. And so it is great to have you with me on the podcast.
Well, I feel the same way. And it was a great company to work at.
And
I think I probably trained 1,000 people there through the years.
Probably. And that's one of the things that gives you great perspective as you are going to share with my audience today. You have spoken to tens of thousands of people over the years. You've been doing this a long time. You've researched this topic of generational relationships for many, many years. You've written several books on the topic. The most recent book that we're probably draw from largely today is called Sticking Points. Let me find the title so I don't mess it up. Sticking
Points.
It's
a long subtitle, isn't it?
Yeah, how to get, and it's got numbers in it. So I thought that was interesting. Sticking Points, how to get 4 generations working together in the 12 places they come apart. And that book has been a success. It continues to be available on Amazon. I'm going to encourage my listeners to grab a copy, and hopefully we pique their interest with our conversation today. So, Haydn, we're talking about a topic that's important to many frontline leaders, HR, strategic leaders, people who sit in the C-suite. It's this burning question of how we hold on to our Gen Z employees and our younger millennials. And oftentimes they're maybe working in the front lines. Maybe they're on the first or second job on their career path. But some of us older guys kind of scratch our heads. Sometimes we get frustrated when they bounce, when they move on to something else. And so what I want to dig in with you today is, how do we hold on to our best young people? And maybe more broadly talk about how we get the different generations working better together. But before we jump into the conversation, tell me a little bit about what got you interested in this topic.
Well, yeah, I was an entrepreneur. I was starting up an organization, and, I'm old enough to where baby boomers were the major younger market. So, I'm at the edge of the baby boomers, the beginning of Gen X. And so they were so different than previous generations. There was such a distinction between traditionalists and baby boomers that there was quite a bit of focus on understanding them. And so that's what got me interested. And I just kept collecting information on that topic over about a 25-year period, and then began to about a 15-year period, and then began to research it heavily after that. So when I started, to dig into, do some heavy research, I had tell you how old I am. A filing cabinet, entire drawer of a filing cabinet of articles and newspaper pieces. And so that was probably the hardest thing of writing the book. It took me about 25 hours to go through that drawer and find the things I would quote from memory. But then in the book, I had to reference where I'd actually found that information. So as I dug through those files, I'm like, oh, that's where I heard that. And that was probably the hardest part of writing the book, is digging back through 15 years of reading things.
Well, I can certainly relate to that. And I think I too have some filing cabinets in my garage still at this point. Let's level set the playing field here for the audience. I believe there are 5 generations that are active in the workplace. Could you go through those, what those generations are called, and maybe roughly some of the years that cover those generations? And then we'll start honing in on how to get people from these generations to work better together. So what are the generations that we've got in the marketplace now?
You bet. So I was able to update the Sticking Points book to include Gen Z in its second edition. So if you do look online, get the one with the orange cover rather than the white cover. I guess they still have some of the first edition in stock, so that's why they have both. But look for the orange cover. And so here are all five, to your point, Mike. Traditionalists, born before 1945, so just think before World War II. People break them down into, and they should break them down into a couple of generations. Those generations were so similar compared to how different I mentioned before the traditionalists and the baby boomers were. The baby boomers came right after World War II, 1946, and that big surge of births. And then I end them at 64. Some people end them at 62. And then Gen Xers, 65 through 1980. Many people make them a shorter generation. And the millennials, 81 through 98. And Gen Z, born after 1998. And right now, nobody knows what we're calling the next generation.
Well, I was just going to ask,
probably 3 or 4 or 5 years old right now.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if there are any new naming conventions on the horizon, or people are starting to think about them. But it's going to be a while before those folks get into the workforce. So let's focus on who's working now. And if we think about the concerns we have about losing younger millennials, Gen Z folks, they join us, they start doing good work, and then they leave us, and us older guys start to pull our hair out over why this is. Let's take an action-oriented stance here, Haydn, and help us think through what are some of the essentials that we as hiring managers, as organizational leaders who have these folks on our team, what do we need to think about in terms of how we interact, beyond thinking about what do we need to do as we work with these younger generations to bring out the best in them and to get them to want to stick around and contribute for as long as they can?
Let me start with a little background to put realistic context to it. Because I think probably the biggest challenge for supervisors, or even, as you pointed out, more senior leaders, is the expectation that they're going to stay 10 years, that we're successful if they quit leaving. And the biggest shift is that there's a new life stage between 18 and 27, 28, that's been identified by psychologists. There hasn't been a life stage identified since the 1890s, when adolescence was identified. So the 1890s is the last time there was a life stage. And that was really the product of people moving from the farm into more urban areas in higher numbers. And they're, for the first time, being this kind of zone where you weren't a child, but you also weren't in the city able to fully function. Whereas on a farm, you could move to the table where the adult males were throwing bales when you were about 12 or 13. You could join them. And so when that transition from childhood to early adult happened on the farm pretty automatic, and then we move into this next stage, there's a new life stage. Well, we've got a new life stage now because of shifts in the way the world works. Matter of fact, I talk about that in some detail, if you want it, in a TED Talk called Why what you've heard about, half of what you heard about millennials is wrong. And the half that's wrong is that turnover is much more a product in the 20s of life stage than it even is of generations. It's a new life stage, so we're going to face it no matter what generation there is. So that's the most important thing, is it's characteristic of a life stage. Change, choice, freedom are the three characteristics of this life stage. And so that does not bode well for turnover. So the question is, how do we reduce it? And I had a guy pull me aside at a speech, and he said to me, "I'll give you a lot of money if you help me identify the people that'll stay 30 years. I said, "I will. You don't have any." So I'm paying for that. I said, I wouldn't either. I don't blame you. That's the most important thing you need to know, is that people haven't been staying for 30 years, for 20 years. That trend has been for shorter and shorter times.
So it is a very unrealistic expectation to think that my Gen Z and younger millennial new employees are going to stay beyond what's a reasonable expectation? If they're not going to stay 30 years, what should I hope for?
Well, I think that's the most practical thing. When you said, let's do something practical, the most practical thing is to quit expecting them to stay 30 years. And so it really depends on if they found love. One of the biggest predictors of whether or not a person stays longer or shorter, or have they figured out who their life partner is, and do they have kids? Once a person has children, they don't move along as quickly. Matter of fact, I got in a little bit of trouble at a company we had both been associated with, because somebody said, "Well, what predicts turnover?" And I was telling them a story of when I was at Latin America, and somebody said, "What can we do? People are leaving for another bank if they pay 50 cents more." I said, "Well, they got to get pregnant, and once they get pregnant, they're more likely to stay." And director of HR threw her hands up in the back of the room and it's like, "You need to word that differently." I was like, okay. And so I think I offended some people with that story, but really that's the biggest predictor is, do you have a life partner, and do you have a kiddo or two? People significantly slow down how quickly they move around because their freedom, the range of their freedom has changed significantly with that. We can't even go out to eat anymore when you've got toddlers, infants, because of the amount of kit you have to pack to be able to go anywhere. It's just easier to stay home.
So has anything changed post COVID in this regard? It seems as though we've got really low unemployment. There are lots of opportunities for folks who are highly skilled and are bright and are capable. There are jobs for them. There's no longer any stigma associated with moving from job to job every year or two. I'll date myself a little bit, Haydn, and you know me, you know how old I am. Back in the day when I was hiring a lot of people, we would get big stacks of paper resumes, literally paper resumes,
right?
And we'd assess them based on whether they were job hoppers. And you can't see me, but I'm doing that air quotes thing. Did they move from job to job in whatever we determine to be an unreasonable amount of time? Did they change jobs often? Were they job hoppers? Job hopper is a word that is sort of a positive thing now for some people, isn't it?
Oh, undoubtedly. And what job hopping means has changed. The Bureau of Labor Statistics uses 3 years as the cutoff point for assessing long-term employees. So when they talk about long-term employees or stable employment, they're talking about 3 years, because the average person stays in a job. This is averaged across the age span. Baby boomers stay a long time in a job, and Gen Z changes much more often. So when you average that all together, it's just a little over 4 years. And so some of us who think long-term employees at being 7, 10, 30 years, that's simply not the norm. And just understanding that allows us to be far more realistic with what we're looking at. The way I like to say it is, we have to quit measuring turnover based on baby boomer statistics. That's the equivalent of not being able to update your apps on your phone, because the iOS for you Apple folks, the iOS is so out of date. Your phone's too old. You just got to get a new phone, because you can't update any of your apps without breaking the thing. And frankly, when it comes to expectations about retention, we brick our efforts when we have such old baby boomer, long range numbers. It hasn't been that way for 15 years, and it's less and less so now. The biggest thing after COVID has been the fact that COVID sucked all of the lowest paid jobs and moved them up.
What do you mean by that?
Lowest paid jobs and moved them up. So that's why many of us discovered that our favorite drive-through has shorter hours even today, because of the challenges with hiring. Because suddenly people who were in minimum wage jobs got moved up to a higher paying jobs, and there's not as many people to pull from in those spots. And so that was the biggest shift, is that massive increase in people shifting. The Great Resignation was just declared by the researcher who coined the phrase, just declared to be over. But it is a trend that is a part of a larger trend. And so I would say Great Resignation is a trend, not a phenomenon.
So big idea number one for this episode is we've got to change the way we think about long-term employment for Gen Z and younger millennials. It's just different. So maybe a better question to ask is, so how do we create environments where we can really bring out the best in the Gen Z and younger millennials while we have them, and maybe make that time we have them just a little longer? Is that a fair question?
No, that's a great question, because let's say you lead people more effectively who are in that emerging adulthood life stage. You lead them more effectively because you relate to their life stage, you relate to what the research shows they want as Gen Z and younger millennials. You do that better. And they stay another 2 years. Or if they're in what Douglas Copeland, the guy that coined the word Gen X, he also coined McJob, kind of like McDonald's. The McJob is a job that is not a job with a direction. It's not a job that you would see as a career, mainly because you can't afford a house, you can't afford childcare. It's not a long-term job. And so especially people in McJobs, if you can keep them 4 or 5 months longer, you dramatically cut your costs. Just talk to a warehouse, CEO of a company in his warehouse. He just spent $4 million trying to keep it just so far this year because of the turnover in the warehouse. And it's a McJob. They're McJobs, what they have particular cost of living. But if they can just reduce that by, 3 months, keep people there 3 months longer, they can knock $1.5 million of that off just right off the top. So, even if they're not staying for 30 years, there's a lot of possibilities there.
So
let me give you a couple of things, because I think the big point here is that great management techniques, what has been classic management techniques, good management techniques, they don't work as well with emerging adults. They just don't fit as well with Gen Z and younger millennials in some key places. And that's why even some of your best managers are still having high turnover, because the classic stuff just doesn't play as well.
So unpack that idea for us,
You bet.
Haydn, because that's a profound and provocative sort of statement. The best management practice doesn't work with this group. Tell us why.
Doesn't work as well. It needs some tweaks. For example, it's always been true that it's important that people don't have to guess how they're doing and who's on their side. One of what I call the 7 essentials. Okay. They don't have to guess how they're doing or who is on their side. What's different about that? Well, I hear all the time, they shouldn't need all this hand holding. I didn't get all this hand holding. They shouldn't need all this hand holding. And that's a significant difference, is how high the expectations are. I think one of the biggest differences after COVID is already high expectations for managers have gone significantly higher. Matter of fact, consistently, the research for Gen Z shows, and not everything, there's not a lot of research studies on a lot of things with Gen Z because they're newer to the workplace, but consistently, multiple studies show that for them, management equals coaching. Mic drop. There's nothing else that to them really matters in terms of what a manager does other than being a good coach. They know there's other parts of the job, but that's just administrative in their mind. And so for people who are like, I wish I had more time for coaching. I understand I need to improve my coaching skills. No, that's all that matters. And so the expectations for the human side of management is so much higher that if they have to guess how they're doing, or if you're on their side, game over. Literally, they shut down the console.
So,
Game's done.
so what you're telling us is that managers need to redefine their view of handholding and redefine that as I need to give good feedback on a regular, ongoing, constant basis. I need to coach consistently. I need to pour into these young folks and help them develop. That's job one for me. That's not a peripheral hand holding, patting people on the back and on the top of the head. I've got to do that. Job one.
And it's a level of supportive feedback. You said it perfectly. And it's a level of supportive feedback that's just different. Being able to make effective feedback adjustments is critical. Having one-on-ones that aren't awkward. One of the best predictors of engagement and how long any generation will stay is how effective the one-on-ones are. But they're somebody my age. I'm like, yeah, if I don't have one-on-one with my boss, whatever. I just left working for a company and I'm now on my own in the last 6 months. If I had a one-on-one once a year, twice a year with my boss, that was fine with me.
Yeah, no news is good news.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Or, I knew, I'd been there a long time. I knew kind of where I stood. That's all right. But, newer to the workforce employees, you can see it on Glassdoor when they write up managers that they were not big fans of. They did not believe that manager was on their side. They did not know where they stood. And so big difference. And so can you do one-on-ones that aren't awkward? And a great one-on-one, the manager is talking less than 60%, less than 40% of the time. So in a half-hour one-on-one, you got to figure out how they do most of the talking. And so right there, most one-on-ones are briefings or project updates. They're not actually engagement one-on-ones, and it's the biggest predictor of whether or not you can keep people. And then being able to raise performance without taking out the juice from someone. I was, my era, our era, we're about a year apart. Our era was the era of giving people corrective feedback without taking their legs out from underneath them. It's just not what people thought about. It's like, yeah, you messed up. Here we go. But today, you can really demotivate a person. And so, sometimes younger generations are called snowflakes. They're simply much more, they've all their lives been coached with a much more positive approach. So a leader just has to learn how to do that. It's not even a supervisor has to, it's not even an option anymore. It's a skill they have to master.
So even my statement from a moment ago, managers have to coach more, give more feedback, interact more with their employee. That even needs to be filtered through this idea you just shared with us, that you've got to let that younger employee share their perspective, do most of the talking. Manager needs to be supportive. It's kind of a kinder, gentler approach to management.
I love the way you said that. That's perfectly said.
Than what I experienced when I entered the workforce in the 80s.
And so I think a key skill under this essential, they don't have to guess how they're doing and who's on their side, is to double your positive to negative ratio. To double your positive, it's a key skill for anyone who is leading, managing, guiding this people in emerging adulthood. Doubling that positive to negative ratio. And for many managers, it's as practical as keeping a list. How many negatives versus positives I said, and checking them off, tracking it, because you'll discover that the negatives glare at us and the positives slide by. We think the positives, we don't always say the positives. We see the negatives, we point out the negatives because we have to. But we don't have to point out the positives. And so that can get really out of whack. Let me give you another one. The fourth of the essential for cutting turnover with emerging adulthood, people in their 20s. They have open conversations about work, the team they're on, and how they're both working in their life. And That's working because they don't surprise you when they leave and they refer people to your organization. So when they do go, they don't surprise you with it. You know they're thinking about it and you've had conversations about it. They're not hiding it from you because you have those open conversations. One-on-ones that are scheduled regularly is a great way to do that. Make sure that happens. If you're surprised and they're not referring people to your organization after they leave, and it's a good indication that they're not in play. I don't want to name who it is, but I was just talking to one of the branches of the military here in the United States. And this is the part that they wanted to focus on most because of some key initiatives they had. They really wanted to focus on leaning into the negative, teaching their managers, supervisors to lean into the negative and to cool your listening. To lean into the negative and cool your listening would be key tools under this essential.
So Hayden, what does this look like practically? Does it mean literally saying, so how's it going? And feel free to tell me what frustrates you. I mean, that's maybe not a very elegant way to say that, but how do you do this in real life?
Well, yes, I would just say yes. And if that's how you speak, I would say it just that way. You go into Glassdoor and you read other things, where the people talk about managers they love. And it's not uncommon to have somebody say, I can talk to them as easily as I can talk to my parents, or I can talk to a friend who's older, or my aunt and uncle. And one manager said to me, my employee thought it was a great compliment to tell me that. I had my employee say to me, wow, this is so easy. I've never had a manager where it's this easy to talk to them as it is to talk to my mom. She said she meant it as a compliment, and I took it that way. But I try not to think of myself as old, and all I could do was put Band-Aids on my emotional wounds of being called old, for the rest of our one-on-one together. But it's meant as a real compliment. It means I can talk to you easily. The research on this is unequivocal. It comes from multiple sources. That if emerging adults have somebody who is older than them or in authority, who they can think out loud with, other than their parents, you are much more likely for them to stay around, even if they discuss leaving with you. So for most of us, Michael, when somebody brings up, hey, I'm thinking about doing something else, I don't know if this industry's for me, I don't know about this job, our first thought is HR is going to call me in and I'm in trouble. I lost another one. Hence, boomer turnover. I can't manage my people. They're leaving all the time. What's wrong with me? So we panic. Instead of cooling down our listening, instead of escalating in our own heads, we cool it all down and go, wait, I got to get mellow. If I don't get mellow, they're not going to think out loud. They're going to read my body language. This is worrying me. They're not going to pursue the conversation. I got to mellow out here. I got to cool my listening, cool my reaction, let them think out loud. And only when they're done thinking out loud do I say something like, well, I had the same questions. I didn't decide to stay in this field, in this industry, in this job without having some real questions to answer. It looks like you're at the time in the career when you're asking those. And then shut up.
Well,
and let them bring the conversation to you. You cool your listening and you lean into the negatives rather than trying to avoid or sell over the negatives or talk over the negatives. Especially for those of us who are older, coaching was trained about what to say, overcoming the objections. You're just helping people think out loud. That's a game changer. And the research shows that can do more than almost anything else to aid people staying longer. They talk about leaving, they stay longer. Who would have thought?
Yeah, that's interesting. And it seems to go back to the idea that you mentioned earlier. It's this acceptance of and this mind shift that not everyone's going to stay for 5, 7, 10, 30 years. They're going to move on. So if I can, so I'm not surprised when they bring these conversations up. I don't need to sell them on staying. I just need to be a sounding board to let them vent and share ideas and be a thought partner with them, and that's going to help them stay. Second thing that came to my mind as you were sharing that, Hayden, is that this idea that, yeah, I can appreciate that concern from the past where you start losing a lot of people and you get called into HR. What's wrong with you? You're running people off. But does HR get it now? Do senior HR leaders recognize what you're talking about maybe better than most?
I'd say 2/3 of the senior HR people I run into see this, get it. And the conversations around quiet quitting or the great resignation, and especially since younger age groups have by far the highest turnover of any people in their 20s are by far the highest turnover group. So I think people see it. People aren't sure how to interpret it or what to do with it, but I think they see it. The one place where I think you might be able to use what we've talked about on this podcast in your conversations is if your particular area within your company or organization disproportionately has new to the workplace employees, you're going to have understandably a higher turnover than you would if you had disproportionately people in their 40s or 50s, because the life cycle, the turnover rates are significantly different in the life cycle. Real quick, I know this surprises a lot of people. The average baby boomer has had 13 jobs in their career. Millennials will have 16. Gen Z will have 20. So the point of it is baby boomers had a lot of jobs. They just had most of them in their 20s. So the 20s are a time when every generation shifts jobs. It's just there's more of that shifting than there was before. That's all. And so fact is, if you got a lot more people in their 20s, then you're going to have more turnover, just like you would have 30 years ago. And that's where sometimes you can be judged. Well, hey, you got really high turnover. Well, look at the proportion of people I have in this stage in their life and in their career. Age your conversation. That's not generational. That's life stage. That's a whole different dimension of generational research. This idea of life stage.
Is there something that hiring managers can do during the recruiting phase, but during the selection process before someone gets hired that might help them stay a bit longer? And I'm talking about the younger millennials, the Gen Z folks. Is there something we should be saying or doing during the selection process that will help us down the road?
Well, that's the first of the essentials. They get told the truth about the job before they get hired. You know, that seems so logical. And it's really not, it's really not. It didn't take a long time to explore that one. It's basically quit hiding the parts of the job that people quit over. Now, here's the worry supervisors have that they battle. Well, they wouldn't want to work here if they knew the tougher parts. Okay. But you bring them in, spend a lot of time working with them, and then they leave because they discover the tougher parts. One manufacturing plant I was working with, the initial jobs are incredibly boring. You are loading lids into a hopper all day long. They've tried different automations, and the automations will break the edges, and it's a food kind of container. And so, stuff spoiling. And so it's just safer, easier to have human beings load them in. And what they decided to do, because of the amount of ghosting and people just not showing, they decided in orientation to take the brand new hires to the balcony and let them watch for about a half hour how things work. Probably 30% of their new hires leave after they get lunch. They stay the 4 hours, they get lunch, they get paid, they get a check, they go, and they make it clear after seeing what the work looks like, you don't want to do this. That's okay. Because they've discovered that it is better to know up front than it is to be surprised when you counted on them for finding a spot, and the absenteeism means that you're just shuffling everywhere. A good friend of mine went into nursing school late in life, and she took a job and really enjoyed the work she did, really liked working with the doctor, but they did not tell her. They told her what the hours were, and that's why she took the job. And then what they said, they kept complaining and writing her up because she wasn't flexible. And she said, "You never described any of this to me." And the hiring nurse said to her, "Well, would you have taken the job if we have told you how much of your time we wanted you to be available to us that we may not pay you for?" She said, "No." She goes, "That's exactly why we didn't tell you. Nurses are hard to find." The irony was she left after 3 months. And if you would have told her that up front, she wouldn't have taken the job. You would not have spent 3 months of sunk costs. So Mike, I think one of the biggest things is crazy. Just don't lie to people. What philosophers and theologians have called the sin of omission. Just quit lying to people about the parts they won't like so they can say yes to those parts up front.
Yeah,
That's the only thing that saved me with the woman I love. We dated a while and she was pretty familiar with the part she didn't like before we signed up. That pretty much saved us. So now she just rolls her eyes because she married me knowing what she was getting into.
honesty is the best policy. I had a guest on the show a couple of episodes ago, and he made the point that it was important to dream with our employees, to think about what their future might be. Is that something you talk about as well? Is it important to have conversations with younger people about what their future looks like, both inside the organization and potentially outside the organization?
Thank you for saying it both ways. I think this, and the answer is yes. I think this executive who's trying to figure out what they could do to slow down a 200% a year turnover in the warehouse, which is not unusual at all for warehousing, is to find out in what ways could you be valuable to people in their career. So what could you offer them that when they leave, they could take it with you, that would make them find it valuable to stay with you a little longer versus pop across the street with their competitor? Because in his case, they're in an area that, where there's a new warehouse that gets opened about every 3 months, and then they always offer more money. And so everybody's now raising what they pay to try to keep people. But what else can you offer to people? And part of what's valuable is is what they can learn, what they can gain, what experiences they can have that they may not be able to use for you, but they can take with them. So many organizations think if I did leadership development with my employees, they would get frustrated because there aren't promotions for them here. True. They would. They will. And if you know they're going to leave you, because most warehousing is a mixed job. There are few that pay enough for certain roles that you could get a house and pay for childcare and all of that in a 2-income household, but not a lot for a lot of positions. And so they're going to leave you. But if they left you with some experiences that they could take with them, there would be for many people, and the kind of people you would want to be there on your team, right? As you said, how do we screen people ahead of time a little bit? Well, kind of people you would want on your team, that would be a perk. That would be a benefit, that they got leadership opportunities that they probably will never be able to use in your organization. What a great example. Well, that's actually the essential number 6. They have clear conversations with their manager about their future. Clear conversations. Most managers are like, matter of fact, one HR director said, every time they come in to talk to me, I fake an aneurysm because I don't know what to tell them about their career. And when I don't have good answers, they leave within 6 months. Okay. So why don't you be honest with them and have those conversations and be seen as a person they can think out loud with and a source of help?
Hayden, I've been part of debates for years, and this was an ongoing debate in the organization you and I met in.
I remember that.
And that's this conversation about, if someone leaves, do we slam the door behind them and lock it so they can never come back because they were, you can label them in whatever way you want to label them, but they can't come back? Or do we leave the door open? If they were a good employee, they were a contributor, they added value, do we leave the door open and welcome them back if their journey brings them back our way? What say you on that topic?
Well, let me flip it around and interview you for a moment. What approach did you argue through the years on that?
Well, my argument was why did they leave? And if they were a good employee and they left and learned something during their time away, call it a prodigal season, perhaps.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't we want them back to bring what they've learned and continue contributing to our team? And on a couple of occasions, and I've hired, I think, 3 or 4 people back who left, they turned out to be some of the most committed, dedicated, loyal, hardworking folks I've ever had the pleasure of working with, because they searched around, knew what they were missing back at home, and I'm doing the air quotes thing again, and they were happy to be back home when we let them back in.
Now, build on that, because that's what I would argue as well. I've seen people who have left and come back, and I've seen the very same thing. Matter of fact, at the organization we're both talking about, one of their most successful managers, regional managers, had left and come back. Part of the reason she was successful, when people complain, she go, "You have no idea what it's like outside. The grass is not greener. It's astroturf covering minefields here." And so she told them the stories, and other people go, "Oh." And there was such credibility. She ended up being one of the top people in the nation in that company because of the camaraderie she could build as a team, because of how convinced she was and how great the culture was. And I've seen that replay itself many, many times. If a person comes back angry about their previous experience and hasn't worked that through, then you bet, probably not the right hire. We're looking for people who are coming toward rather than running away. It's, I think, a good truism in the world of hiring. Are they leaving something, or are they coming to something? People need to work out that baggage. But I'll tell you what, with emerging adulthood, people in their 20s, this idea that they're going to stay, hopefully we've debunked that. But if we know they're going to leave, often to find love. I was chatting with someone who said, "I surprised my boss because they have me in their succession plan, but I've been talking to somebody I met on Match.com who's in Seattle, and we've been meeting every month, and we think we think we can make this work, and it's much easier for me to move to Seattle than for her to move here." And so my boss their comment was, "Well, who am I going to put to replace you in my succession plan?" And I'm like, "Well, that's really not my problem." But anyway, and what for them seemed like a crazy reason. Another one said, "My boss is really floored because I'm going to go hike Asia for a year." And the boss was like, "You're going to do what? You're 27. He goes, "Yeah, but I broke up with my long-term relationship. I'll never get another chance. I got enough money in the bank saved up where I can hike for a year. And then I'll come back and get a job." He's like, "Well, I don't know what you're doing to your career." He goes, "I don't know. International business wants actual feet on the ground immersion experience. I don't know how I could get a better experience than going through 5 countries in Asia on foot." The boss went, "Oh, yeah. Huh. Wow. Okay." Then they say, "Well, our generation would never have done that." And the fact that people leave and want to come is a great opportunity to even find new hires. I think one of the little used strategies is to have a mailing list, a text message list of people. It'll give you permission, but of people who allow you to contact them and say, "Hey, we're hiring. Who do you know?" They often know people back in this case, Chicago. Now that they're in Seattle, who else do you know in Chicago who might consider working here? Who you would recommend to us? Well, one of your best sources for people who have already been screened, to go back to your question, Mike, about what do we look for ahead of time? Well, the people we like are going to know the people we would like. And so one of the best ways to screen candidates is to have people who left us recommend people. But if we don't think that way, once you leave, you're dead to me, which is kind of classic. We think that way, then we miss out on a huge opportunity to get great candidates handed to us. Sorry, indeed. But an even better source is are people on our list who have left. We invite them back, and they may come back. A lot of times people come back to where they have grandparents to make childcare easier, quite bluntly. And so they move into a new life stage and move closer to us. We want to be top of mind. So that's it.
I appreciate that, Hayden, and I think that was a good way to view that question. Let me give you one more raging debate kind of question. And hopefully this doesn't throw you. What do you advise your clients when someone says we're losing people? When someone tells us they're going to leave, should we offer them more money to try to convince them to stay? What do you say?
The research on this is unequivocal. So I think this one's easy to answer. Only 1 out of 8 people who ask for more money when they come in to quit, only 1 out of 8 people who receive more money stay longer than 2 years. Because money is almost never the whole thing. If they come in and have a conversation around what they want to be different in their life, in their job, if you've been having the one-on-ones and there's no surprises there, then you know the full package of how they're seeing the world. But if you give them money, they'll take the money. And we all know money is a hygiene factor, to use that classic terminology from 40 years ago. It's a hygiene factor, and it lasts a week in terms of motivating people. And it's good. I'd take the raise, but that's not the full package of what it's about. So that one's an easy one to answer. It just doesn't work out in real life.
Yeah, I agree with that fully, but it still happens. I talking to a younger friend from church just last week. She went in and told her employer that she was leaving. She'd found a new opportunity that she thought was a better fit, and it just so happened to pay more money. And the first thing her previous employer said was, "Well, what are they going to pay you? Maybe we can match it to get you to stay." And I just threw my hands up. She didn't even want to engage in that conversation. And I encouraged her and said, good call, because you're moving on for more reasons than money. And I think that's most often the case. Haydn, I can't believe how quickly the time has flown by. I think we've talked longer than I normally talk to people, but that's because we were talking about really good stuff. Let me give you my final question that I always leave my episodes, my guests, my listeners with, and that's this one. What is the one thing that my listeners can begin doing right away if they want to be a better leader, build stronger teams, and hold on to their good people just a little longer? What would you tell them?
If you'll think about why somebody else might want something, even if your business model, you're a nonprofit, there's no way you could raise the money to cover that. You're a business, it would blow a hole in your business model. You just wouldn't be able to stay in business if you did it. If you can understand why they want that and have a conversation about it, and then clarify what the business needs, but also how you understand what they need, and then let them talk. Most people will appreciate that you care about them as a person and not just about the business goals. And they won't be happy that the other business can't do whatever they would like, but they believe you care. Most of us can do that. We can articulate where the business is at without making it look like we care more about profitability than we do about people. And across all the generations, the research shows that idea that companies put profits before people is becoming kind of the kiss of death. It is the quickest way to get canceled as a manager or a leader. And all of us can get more nuance at doing that. All of us can get better at that. Be a person that communicates people first, even when the answer's no, we can't afford it.
Haydn, I appreciate the wisdom you shared with my audience. I've loved our conversation. We've been
so much fun. Thank you.
We've been talking to Haydn Shaw. He's the author of Sticking Points: How to Get 4 Generations Working Together in the 12 Places They Come Apart. That book and his other books are available on Amazon. Haydn is now an independent consultant and speaker focused on topics of generational leadership, retention, these things we've been talking about today. He's the expert on, and he would love to come work with you and your organization. So I'd encourage you to reach out to him if his ideas to be of interest. His contact information is there in the show notes. And I always appreciate people who help us think differently about leadership and teamwork and do so from a data-driven, fact-based perspective. And certainly Haydn's work is grounded in research, as well as many years of experience, and it's practical, it works. So to all of my listeners, thank you for being with me in this kind of conversation. We do this on a regular basis, and we hope we're adding value to your leadership journey. And I believe we are. So until next time, mission first, people.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to create a stronger, more people-centric and empowered culture for your organization, visit drmikepatterson.com